世界的变化速度越来越快，芯片。
Welcome to what seems to be the new front line of the US-China tech war.
You know, more than 13,000 people work for SMIC. It's an amazing corporation.
This is a corporate video promoting China's Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, smiling executives and high-tech chips being laser cut. It looks great, but all is not well in SMIC land, nor amongst other makers of Chinese consumer technology. Washington is threatening to extend commercial sanctions to firms like these, and chips are one area where China depends on overseas manufacturers, companies like Samsung and Intel and others. Huawei, China's biggest phone and laptop maker, is most at risk, it seems. Following US sanctions, it's no longer got access to Google's Android software, and with an outright ban on Western microchips from Wednesday, it's going to get a lot worse, according to Dan Wang. He's a technology analyst at Gavical Dragonomics, a consultancy in Beijing.
It is not just the May restriction from the Department of Commerce that will kick in on September 15th. It is also a restriction put in place on August 20th that makes pretty much every semiconductor that uses any US technology, which means pretty much all semiconductors, out of reach for Huawei. And so if Huawei does not have the most important components in, digital technologies, then it really has a lot of trouble actually making its smartphones as well as its base stations.
So anyone buying a Huawei mobile phone, a Huawei laptop from next year is going to receive an inferior product?
Many more than a million, Ed. It's going to be a multiple billion-dollar question. And so based on the current restrictions, if the US government is enforcing these restrictions very severely, I think Huawei will not even be able to manufacture any of its smartphones, any of its base stations, or any of its laptops, such that consumers cannot even find these things in stores. And service operators wouldn't be able to buy these to make 5G networks.
但很遗憾的是，这美国的第二轮制裁，我们的芯片生产只能接受到5月15号之前。
That's Huawei's CEO Richard Yu making a speech last month in which he acknowledged that Huawei would no longer be able to manufacture its high-end Kirin chips due to the sanctions. But as we've heard, this could be even worse for the company. I asked consultant Dan Wang whether the outcome of this year's presidential election in the US, for example, maybe a victory for the opposition Democrats, might yet offer Huawei a lifeline out of its fix.
Well, it's certainly worth noting that many US firms have been lobbying very hard for the US government to relax some of these restrictions. Huawei claims that it bought around $19 billion worth of US technologies last year. And so a lot of these firms, especially the semiconductor firms, are going up to the US government and saying, well, we need to maintain access to not just Huawei, but also the Chinese market, which is for everyone either the largest market or the fastest growing market. The US government is fairly receptive often to industry concerns, but it is also worth noting that Huawei is treated as a uniquely bad actor, considered a national security risk by both the Democrats and also the Republicans. So that might be a little bit, there will be a lot of tensions there. I think it's also worth noting that, yes, Huawei is indeed very big and it is indeed technologically very sophisticated, but the US government has demonstrated extraordinary will to expand extraterritoriality to place pretty much every semiconductor technology under its jurisdiction to say, we don't really want these things going to Huawei, which we consider to be a bad actor.
Well, as mentioned, the context of this crisis for Huawei is the presidential election in America. Were Joe Biden to win the White House, that could perhaps signal a shift in Washington's hawkish approach towards Chinese tech firms. Certainly, the Trump campaign would like us to think so.
A global crisis. President Trump took action, but Joe Biden attacked Trump after the China travel ban.
Xenophobia and fear-mongering.
A TV commercial for the Trump campaign. Well, whether that's fair or not, it seems the Biden camp is equally keen to paint the president as a China-loving lightweight.
Trump praised the Chinese 15 times in January and February as the coronavirus spread across the world.
It's a tough situation. I think they're doing a very good job.
Are you concerned about its potential impact on the global economy?
So who is right in all of this? Or Is this actually one subject on which the two campaigns agree pretty much? I asked Daniel Russell. He's the Vice President of the Asia Society in the US. He's a former advisor on East Asian affairs in the Obama White House and a man unofficially, we are told, very much with the ear of the Joe Biden campaign.
The big difference is that Trump is a child of privilege. His orientation is to gripe and complain about China's unfairness and to blame others. He's an isolationist, and that's what his America First is all about. It's about building walls, closing borders, purging the U.S. of people who don't look like him. But Biden's orientation is to outcompete the other guy. International engagement and leadership is very much in Biden's DNA. He's a true believer in strong alliances. So I think the big differences will come in the fidelity to international agreements and multilateral institutions, and to develop the close partnerships with other democracies, and that the U.S. has a role as a champion of democracy and human rights and international law and so on.
Yeah, you see, a critic will say that it was when Joe Biden was vice president, when you were in the administration, that the Chinese got ahead through rampant intellectual property theft, which wasn't really challenged for many years.
The effort to push back and safeguard U.S. interests against Chinese intellectual property theft and its cyber-enabled espionage began to ramp up in the United States over the 8 years of the Obama presidency as the attacks began to ramp up. And the Obama administration was very successful ultimately in 2016 in compelling China to accept and adhere to an agreement on cyber theft. Now, not everything is knowable in the cyber world, but by and large, we did see an improvement. It's called diplomacy. It isn't easy, it's diplomacy. And the absence of diplomacy between the United States and China, certainly in the last 3 years, has made the problems worse.
You're saying that China's behavior has deteriorated as a result of the trade wars and the America First policy?
There's no question about that. And it should not come entirely as a surprise that if the U.S. government labels China as an enemy, treats China as an enemy, then gradually over time we will find that in China we have an enemy.
Do you think that compromise is possible over the status of Hong Kong right now? Do you think compromise is possible over the status of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang? I mean, China's militancy seems as austere as one could imagine almost.
It is a lot easier to create a problem than it is to solve a problem. And problems that have been neglected or mishandled tend to get worse. And that is certainly the case both in Hong Kong and in Xinjiang. But this is where we are, and we need an administration that is going to adopt and pursue an integrated, multilateral, and sensible policy to try to improve where we can.
The former Obama White House official Daniel Russell. Well, for a perspective from the Trump campaign, we did approach the Commerce Department, which has been leading negotiations with China during the trade war. Nobody was available for comment from them, but the administration does point critically to numerous Biden statements in the past in which he has spoken approvingly of Beijing as a diplomatic and trading partner. It can also point, you might argue, to those semiconductor sanctions and perhaps the reported sale of US TikTok to Oracle, signs that its get tough policy is perhaps bearing fruit. Anyway, what does China think about all of this? Who would it prefer to see win the White House? I asked Ray Zhong. She is a China-focused expert based at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C.
I don't think that China's priorities in terms of its own development trajectory would differ between Trump and Biden. Since 2016, it's been really focused on funding indigenous innovation, technical development, and tech incubators. And it's really been trying to build a status as a risen power versus a rising power. China has really been about putting Xi Jinping thought in a place of permanence and solidifying his power base very, very rapidly.
Yeah, I mean, Xi Jinping thought what that means is a far more muscular nationalist profile on the world stage, a more aggressive stance to those who defied Chinese policy.
I would say that, yeah, for China, internal stability and the political survival of the Chinese Communist Party, that is the core goal.
Do you think that the US and China then feed off each other? That there are enemies that need to exist for each other? They each, a bit like perhaps at the height of the Cold War, US and the Soviet Union were bogeymen and opponents, that this is now the same, and that the Chinese leadership depends on the rabble-rousing effect of anti-US sentiment?
Well, the difference between U.S.-China dynamics and U.S.-Soviet Union dynamics is globalization. You cannot really functionally put globalization back in the box. A lot of firms, in looking at the trade war between China and the U.S., have really tried to sketch out the reliance on Chinese supply chains, on labor. So I think that the dynamics are not one that would be impacted a lot by the 2020 election.
Ray Zhong of the Wilson Center in Washington. There is much, of course, that can yet change on all of this. Before November the 3rd, the fallout over Huawei could intensify. There is ongoing regional tension with India and Australia to consider. But will any of this change the election itself? Do voters in America really care about China amidst all the economic and public health turmoil that's going on at home? I asked the seasoned political scientist Ian Bremmer of the Eurasia Group.
It's probably a little bit less important today than it was, say, a month ago in terms of the electoral campaign. Simply because the news cycle only has room for so much screaming, and every day there is a new thing to scream about, right? Whether it's the Woodward book or 200,000 coronavirus deaths, there's just a lot, right? And so I would argue that China is critical. It's something that comes up in pretty much every speech that Trump gives, but it's not what's dominating the news in the U.S. as we think about the election right now.
Yeah, I would have thought that for most elections in the U.S. history, foreign policy is something that doesn't swing many voters.
Well, nothing is swinging many voters right now. They have decided, they are polarized, and they really dislike the other side, right? In the case of China specifically, I think there are two reasons it really matters. The first is it's an external enemy. They're responsible for coronavirus. They're the ones that covered it up. They're ripping us off, and that's why the economy is not doing as well. And by the way, it's also important that Biden and Trump are both trying to outdo each other in terms of how effectively hardline they would be on China. I mean, this is the one issue out there that you have broad agreement on across the political spectrum in the United States right now.
In terms of this geopolitical struggle, in terms of the technological Cold War, as people are talking about it now, does it make any difference who wins this election?
Sure, of course it does. If there is an accident between the United States and China, it's much less likely to escalate unintentionally if Biden is president. I mean, right now, the only regular high-level conversations that are happening between the world's two largest economies is between the U.S. trade rep Lighthizer and Liu He, his opposite number. We don't have high-level diplomatic engagement. I think that if Biden were to win, even though the general orientation of policy on all of these issues, South China Sea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Uyghurs, tech, trade, they're pretty similar, but you would suddenly have a constellation of regular high-level engagement between the United States bureaucracy and the Chinese bureaucracy, and that's meaningful, even if it doesn't change the policy itself. The second point is that U.S. policy would at least attempt to become more coordinated on China with other countries.
Who does Xi Jinping want to see win this election?
That's a really interesting question. I believe that Xi Jinping has a slight preference for Trump and those that support Xi Jinping's policies. Because let's keep in mind, under Xi Jinping, there's been enormous consolidation of control. The anti-corruption campaign, Belt and Road, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, running the world in artificial intelligence, Hong Kong national security law. I mean, this stuff is all being driven by Xi, not to mention end of term limits for the Chinese president. And I think that even though Xi Jinping understands that his relationship with Trump is not good, Trump alienates so many other leaders around the world that creates more space for the Chinese to play. So I think he sees an opportunity there. But I think that there are a lot of people among Chinese political elites that think that Xi Jinping is entirely too risk acceptant, is willing to be much more of a nationalist, much more aggressive than they're comfortable with. And the wolf warrior diplomacy that many talk about around Xi Jinping, that sees Trump's mistakes in international diplomacy as opportunity, I'm not sure that there's broad agreement on that.
Ian Bremmer, president of the Eurasia Group in the US.